was just entering the boat.
Oh, that'll be an interesting trip for him. Oh, cool.
And I don't think we can take it on the boat.
No, probably can't take it on the boat.
Yeah, apparently they're racist.
Oh, who do you think's gonna win? I think the ones on the left.
I don't know. It looks like to me they're going at the same speed.
Oh yeah.
The one on the right is gonna win because they're pedaling just a few milliseconds faster.
Ah.
Look at that.
Wow. Try to do this up. Let's see if you can. See if one gap. That's right. Here. Look, there's people tenting up there. In the trees there, do you see? Right in the trees, there's a big tent.
This is going to be the first stop on our tour today under the Midtown Bridge, built in 1955. Here we have 3 different colored lines on this pillar. We use these 3 different colored lines to measure the height of the spring flood. The bottom blue line is the normal spring flood. That is where the water should be. The yellow or the orange line is when we have to start sandbagging and getting our homes ready for floodwater and preparing for evacuations. And the red line, if the water comes anywhere near that red line, that is when we begin mass evacuations. Not just for the areas around Winnipeg, but areas within the city itself, including the downtown. Now, the only times in recent history the water has gotten anywhere close to that red line is the 1950 flood and the historic 1997 flood of the century.
I like how they're stopped.
What?
I like how they're stopped.
Oh yeah, it's nice how they stop and they explain what the history is and interesting facts.
This is our second
The building
stop.
on our right here is the Manitoba Legislative Building. This is where our provincial government works. Opened in 1920, this building took 7 years to construct. And the reason it took 7 years is for 3 very good reasons. Number 1, the First World War. Number 2, the Spanish flu. And number 3, most importantly, because the contractor was stealing supplies to build his own house. The statue at the top there is what we call the Golden Boy. He is a statue of the Greek messenger god Hermes, and he is coated in an almost pure 24 karat gold coating. I think that'd be worth quite a lot of money, a big statue made of gold. Unfortunately, his gold coating is micro thin, so you'd probably end up getting more for the bronze underneath. This gentleman in front of us,
Yeah.
who's technically
Louis Riel
behind
is the
legislative
statue.
building, is Louis Riel, and he is considered the father of Manitoba. And in 1869-1870, he led the Red River Rebellion, sometimes known as the Red River Resistance. And he did this so Manitoba could eventually be incorporated into the Canadian Confederacy in 1870. Later in the 1880s, he led what is known as the Northwest Rebellion in what is today Saskatchewan. And it was there that he was captured, tried, and hung for treason. Later on in the tour, I will show you all where he is buried.
Look at how the graffiti people do. See, they write their names and stuff.
The historic Forks Port.
Halfway.
And if you've walked around this area long enough, you'll probably notice that there's a lot of train stuff. And that is because this whole area here at one point was a huge rail yard. In fact, it was one of the biggest in the British Empire. Some believe it was even the biggest. I'd like to bring your attention to the Forks Market, which is just coming into view. This building is actually made out of two pre-existing buildings, and these are both horse stables. And the horses in these stables would be used to help load and unload the trains and steamboats coming from the United States and Saskatchewan. Buildings of a similar era are the Johnson Terminal, and even the Children's Museum is built from an old train repair shop.
You know what? Now if I think about it, look at that bicycle here.
It looks like a real regular bicycle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm glad you pointed it out. The Red and the Assiniboine are the name of the rivers. That's why we're called the Forks, because that's where the rivers fork together, join up.
Structure on our left behind the trees is the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and it is actually only one of two museums in the country to receive national funding built outside of Ottawa. When it opened in 2014, it was by far the biggest change to the Winnipeg skyline since the opening of the Esplanade Riel, the small footbridge that is currently in front of us. This bridge is what's known as a side spar cable stayed bridge. And what that means is that the big stick holding everything up is on one side of the bridge. Similar designs can be found in both Israel and the United Kingdom. Originally, when this bridge opened, they had some restaurants in there. Unfortunately, these restaurants had no parking, and nobody wants to walk through -40 weather for a hamburger.
Well, that's a nice view of the Human Rights Museum.
The docks directly in front of us are the Alexander Docks, and they've certainly seen better days. These docks were built in the late 1920s, and they were used to dock the big steamboats and fishing boats from Lake Winnipeg. When these boats would dock here, they would immediately want to sell their cargo. So a lot of markets and shops opened in this area of the city. And that is why to this day it is still known as the Exchange District.
Hi.
Here you will see a large concrete pillar. This is a rock climbing wall or a rock climbing pillar. And during our annual winter festival, the Festival de Voyageur, what they will do is they will put a fire hose at the top, let water run down and freeze. People will then be climbing up and down what is essentially a small glacier. And if you ask me, I think they're crazy. In front of us, behind the trees, you will see a large wooden wall. This wooden wall belongs to Fort Gibraltar, or rather the replica of Fort Gibraltar. The original fort was built in the early 1800s, and it served as a resupply station for the voyageurs who would travel up and down Canada's waterways. This fort was also involved in a minor conflict known as the Pemmican War. This was a war between the Northwest Company, who owned the fort, and the Hudson's Bay Company over the trade routes to a valuable food source known as pemmican. Now, what is pemmican? Pemmican is a food made of dried shredded meat, animal fat, and sometimes currants or raisins. And the reason this food was so important to the voyageurs is because it did not require any refrigeration. They could simply keep it in their bag or their pocket and eat it when needed.
It's ground into
the
a powder.
militia from this fort
Meat
was involved in
ground
a
into a
small
powder.
battle not far from here known as the Battle of Seven Oaks. If you drive down Main Street, you can find a small monument. In this battle, the militia defeated professional soldiers of the Hudson's Bay Company who came from the Red River Colony. This is what we now call Winnipeg. Of course, the soldiers of the Hudson's Bay Company would come back a few years later and destroy the fort. The war ended in 1821 when the British government was so sick and tired of their two companies constantly fighting each other that they forced them to merge together into what we now know as the Hudson's Bay Company.
Yeah. Oh, that's